Most of the horror films on the market were doing poorly at the box office and being dismissed by critics. From this grew a desire for a fresh horror franchise that represented the new generation of audience members and horror fans. Scream, directed by Wes Craven and written by Kevin Williamson, was released in 1996 under Dimension Films. The franchise follows the slasher movie-loving teenage community of Woodsboro, California, being harassed over the telephone before being gruesomely murdered by the iconic masked killer Ghostface. Scream would see moderate success during its initial release in December 1996. However, due to its appeal to teenage audiences, particularly amongst teenage girls, and the word of mouth it generated, in April 1997, the film was re-released and would reach a domestic gross of $103 million. The highest worldwide gross for a slasher film until Halloween in 2018. Inspired by many a slasher film that had come before it, such as Halloween and When a Stranger Calls, Scream is now considered a seminal and canonical text within the horror genre, not only for its metatextual analysis and affectionate homages to the slasher genre, effectively demonstrating the genre's cinematic importance and history, but also for how it influenced the horror that preceded it. It was also one of the first horror films to represent the MTV generation of teenagers in the 90s. Teenagers who are edgy, smart, and who knew the typical conventions of horror films. Scream's influence on the entire horror genre is palpable, even to this day, and there continues to be a legion of Scream fans, as well as consistent plans for future additions to the franchise from major studios. This episode is actually pretty exciting for me, because not only is this one of my favourite horror movies, but this is actually some theory that I'm pretty interested in talking about. Today we'll be examining Scream through a queer lens and questioning both the queer coding of the Ghostface killers, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher, and Scream's representation of radical queerness and the disrupted male body at the hands of its final girl, Sidney Prescott, both through the means of gender and sexuality. So, let's jump right into it. Throughout the film's runtime, the audience is positioned alongside Sidney and naturally sympathised with her, so when the narrative reveals Billy Loomis, Sidney's boyfriend, and Stu Macher, his best friend, as the killers, we are just as shocked as she is. To many an academic and fanfic writer, or both, the homosocial dynamic displayed by Billy and Stu throughout the film can easily be read as that of secret gay lovers, two boys masquerading their heterosexuality as much as they masquerade their innocence. There are vague suggestions and hints of this dynamic throughout the film, with Stu being described as Billy's little lapdog, and the two of them threaten, presumably straight, film buff Randy, by pinning him between their bodies and toying with him.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
But it is only after their reveal as the killers are they able to come out and express their attraction for each other openly. After their reveal to Sidney, their self-imposed proximity instantly closes. Stu, in particular, becomes almost inseparable from Billy. He wraps his arms around his middle, he presses his nose into Billy's hair, and looks at him with an almost loving gaze while taunting Sidney. Though they are simple displays of affection, gay men, particularly closeted, often struggle to show these displays out of fear of harassment. Therefore, because they have revealed themselves to Sidney on their own terms, they are now comfortable with showing affection towards one another. The two drag Sidney into the kitchen, the mother's hearth, which also symbolises her womb, and after explaining their plans to frame Sidney's father for the Ghostface killings, a rejection of the father figure is often associated with gay men, the two stab each other in order to sell the illusion that they were innocents left for dead. The camera lingers on the two boys penetrating each other with close-ups of their faces with each metaphorical thrust. Billy is instructive and methodical in his penetration,
Stay to the side and don't go too deep.
while Stu is more enthusiastic.
Yeah! I'm ready, baby! Alright! Get up! Yeah, man, get up!
Perhaps aligning them with the sexual dynamic of the dominant and submissive. But the penetration isn't quick and simple as Billy would like it to be. It's painful and drawn out, as gay sex can be, and Billy even goes too deep at one point. Freudian theory would designate Billy and Stu's penetration as inherently phallic, and much like in Nightmare 2 in the previous episode, because they cannot have sex with each other, their desire must instead be displayed through violence. And on the subject of Freudian theory, my very least favourite kind of theory.
Guys! I got a pocket knife.
Just cut it out of the frame.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
There we go, because I've had enough of this dude.
Billy's character could be read as rooted in Freud's theory of the negative Oedipal complex amongst gay males. Freud theorizes that the negative Oedipal complex is rooted in a gay man's identification with the mother, which develops into a narcissistic desire to love other men as their mothers loved them. Billy's entire motivation is rooted in his maternal abandonment as a result of his parents' divorce, something he blames both Sidney's mother and Sidney herself for, and his yearning for motherly identification pushes him into the realms of queer villainy. And while Freud's theory is deeply contested for adequate reason, being able to align Billy's motives with this level of theory legitimizes his queer coding in the context of queer academia. Additionally, for all the metatextuals out there, from the moment Billy reveals himself as the killer, everything about him can be read as deeply rooted in a cinematic queer sensibility. After presumably being stabbed by Ghostface, his blood-soaked wardrobe mimics James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, a text often read through a queer lens, with Dean himself being speculated as gay. He quotes Anthony Perkins as Psycho's Norman Bates, another famously speculated gay actor, saying,
We all go a little mad sometimes.
Before he shoots Randy. He then sucks dyed corn syrup off his fingers, how he effectively faked his death or masked his homosexuality, citing it as
Same stuff they use for pig's blood in Carrie.
another film deeply rooted in queer sensibility and gay culture, and associating himself with a regressive orality, as well as the metaphorical female world of suffering, blood, and victimization. Billy's references to cinema, specifically queer horror cinema, aligns with queer readings of metatextuality. He cannot confront his own killings without it, much like he cannot confront his own queerness. While Scream makes several references to Psycho, another Hitchcock film Scream inadvertently references is Rope, with both films effectively operating as fictional retellings of the 1924 Leopold and Loeb murder case. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were two well-educated and wealthy students at the University of Chicago, who kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks out of a desire to commit the perfect crime and prove their intellectual superiority. Academics have retroactively theorised that Leopold and Loeb might have been closeted gay lovers, and many filmic and theatrical adaptations of this case have followed suit in depicting their fictional representations of the killers as romantically involved, or at the very least deeply queer-coded. Schildkraut writes about Leopold and Loeb, stating, "We recreate queer killers in dramatic narratives that provide opportunity to reassess their criminality, and when we apply this idea to Billy and Stu, reading them as queer men whose perceived heterosexual lives were essentially as much of a play as the film they inhabited, their own criminality can be potentially reassessed when we view them through a queer lens." Stu is particularly compelling in this regard, because of how quickly his personality changes after his reveal as the killer. Matthew Lillard's performance is incredibly demonstrative, flamboyant, and arguably camp. Graven in De Angelis writes about this performance, describing it as eschewing standard male stoicism, and compares it to a drag act, therefore ascribing to Medhurst's definition of camp, enacting outrageous inversions of aesthetic and gender codes. When Sidney escapes, she asks Stu for his motive behind the murders, since Billy's Oedipal motive is clear. Stu remarks,
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
Suggesting he doesn't actually have one. However, Stu's lack of a motive can also be read as a kind of devotion and love for Billy, to the point of committing murder for him. Stu's chief affectional energies are directed towards Billy, to whom he is devoted, to the degree that Billy's motive essentially becomes Stu's motive, exempling a textbook display of a mimetic desire. Originally theorized by René Girard, mimetic desire is a hysteria defined by a desire to mirror another person's illnesses, and is often associated with bisexuality and a kind of gender-bending hysteria, in which a person may not have total control over the body or mind. Stu's love for Billy overrides any of his other desires, to the point where he essentially rejects heteronormative masculinity for that which is queer. When considering and reading Lillard's performance through a queer perspective, the intersections of gender and sexuality in Scream's queer subtext becomes all the more apparent. Now, let's talk about the 90s. In line with discussions of queerness, both in regards to sexuality and gender, the 90s were particularly emblematic of these conversations for a number of reasons. Scream was released at the time of third wave feminism was at its peak, with feminist discourse shifting discussions onto sexual liberation, diversity, and intersectionality, and how LGBTQ+ identifying people may be part of the feminist discussion. The mainstream perceptions of sexuality and gender were beginning to become more fluid, and this opened the opportunity for less binary representations of both male and female characters in pop culture. The riot girl music movement filtered deceptively male punk culture of the 80s and early 90s through a declaratively female politicized gaze. Through riot girl, aggressive women became commodified to a degree, a financial draw for young feminists. And the slasher genre was significantly influenced by the financial success of these radically aggressive women amongst audiences. Screaming women were no longer only associated with pain, they become associated with a radical anger too. Sidney Prescott became a female character that was emblematic of the 90s final girl rage.
Like, here she's literally using the imagery of a cowering woman to fight back against a man trying to kill her. Like, how punk rock can you get, right?
Though she was still aligned with typical slasher tropes, studious and somewhat masculinized, she also represented a newly sexually liberated final girl, as she has sex with Billy in the final act of the film and still survives. In post-90s slasher, the final girl character became more than just a trope of the slasher genre. She became an integral component to slashers, to perhaps the entire horror genre, functioning for a post-third wave feminist audience, and a large pull for female slasher and horror fans out of a desire to see women succeed against male aggressors. Sidney is especially emblematic of this idea of female rage, since every Scream movie essentially devoted a sequence in the finale to her fighting back against the masked Ghostface and those behind the mask. This additionally became a pull for queer male audiences as well, as often queer men don't identify with the straight, often white male heroes of action, comedy or romance, and instead find themselves being more sympathetic to the final girls in horror. This sympathetic plight with the final girl from both women and queer men demonstrates the fluidity of gender expression and the degradation of the rigorous gender binary that was rampant in pre-90s cinema. Through earlier introduced definitions of queerness and gender theory by Mark Fortier and Eve Sedgwick, Williamson's depiction of strong women and female bonds through the female members of his cast hints at a more radical sensibility. Indeed, these representations of outspoken women also root Scream in a kind of queerness. The bonds that Scream's women share leans towards a radical depiction of femininity and offers a different, or queered, kind of representation of women in turn. Additionally, Scream's representation of its male characters represents a shift in cinematic masculinity. Billy and Stu are the film's killers, but they are easily distracted and outwitted by Sidney and the other women in the cast. Randy is a virginal, studious film geek who operates as a kind of final boy figure, much like Jesse Walsh in Nightmare 2. Dewey, Woodsbury's deputy sheriff, is somewhat bumbling and virginal himself, and quickly swoons over the much more competent and successful Gale Weathers. Scream uses its male character's semi-incompetence to reiterate its female character's strengths. Dewey is a police officer, a traditional authority figure in cinema, but it is Gale and Sidney who take the killers down in the end. Even the cold open of the film, which depicts Casey Becker being tormented and brutally killed by Ghostface, represents a different kind of female character to what audience members had seen before. At the time of its release, Drew Barrymore was a large box office draw, with a persona through the early 90s as rebellious and sexy. However, Barrymore's previously exploited sex appeal was de-emphasized, with her wardrobe consisting of a baggy sweater and sweatpants, and outside of the slasher tradition of mindless female killings, her death brings about an intense sadness and mourning among the community of Woodsboro. The women of Woodsboro represented a radical kind of femininity that the 90s represented. Finally, Scream represents a rare depiction of gender fluidity, only possible because of the gender and sexuality dynamics of the 1990s. Despite their sexy masculine voice at the hands of off-screen Robert L. Jackson, and coding reinforcing our assumption of a masculine adversary,
sometimes fear and sexuality overlap.
Yeah, often.
Ghostface as a figure is both female and male. While other slasher villains are traditionally binary gendered in their presentation, with some exceptions such as James Gumb in Silence of the Lambs and Angela in Sleepaway Camp, throughout the franchise, Ghostface has been male 5 times and female 4 times, placing Scream into an even broader queer context. In line with this discussion, towards the climax of the film and after escaping, Sidney cockily taunts and harasses Billy as Ghostface, effectively taking on the persona of her masculine aggressor, even calling Billy a
pansy-ass mama's boy,
a fairly explicit term for an effeminate gay man. To place this into a further genderqueer narrative, Sidney then proceeds to come out of the closet and phallically penetrate Billy dressed as Ghostface. Reading this through a queer lens potentially shifts the binary female way the audience perceives Sidney, and even offers the dynamic between Sidney, Billy and Stu as a kind of love triangle between 3 men. One that, like previous gay relationships discussed, can only realise its desire through violence. Scream effectively demonstrates a modern depiction of queerness, both through its subtextually queer villains and its radical final girl. While operating as the most financially successful slasher film released, Scream represents a text that directly responds to the politics in which it was released and creates an ongoing discussion about the relationship women and queer men have with the horror genre. Scream started what academics now refer to as the postmodern age of slashers. Films like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and Urban urban legend, represented a new age of the slasher film, still inspired by the golden age, but rooted in not only a kind of self-reflexive humour, but a deeper connection to the teenage protagonist killed off. The audience perception of horror and the slasher genre had once again been queered, coming after what we had before deemed as modern, and therefore, post-90s, there was room for this perception to be queered again, through a text that was not only subtextually queer, but explicitly so.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching the video. I'm sorry if I sound a bit insane, but it is very late at night and I wanted to get this out as soon as I could for all of you. The support that I've gotten regarding this series has been so overwhelming and so humbling and just so welcome. So thank you so much for everyone who's been keeping up to date with this series and been sending me support. It really means so much. Please stay tuned for my next episode, hopefully soon, on the tumultuous release of Hellbent in 2004. Yeah, so anyway, have a great day, have a great holiday season, stay safe, and always remember, stay spooky.